Now, for the part you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. When discussing Australian foreign policy, global issues and international relations, Australia is fortunate enough to have a range of experts who can speak on the topic. It is a rare few, however, that have the unparalleled knowledge and experience of the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, and today we are delighted to introduce him as our keynote speaker. As Prime Minister, Mr. Fraser was a passionate advocate of global justice, bringing an incomparable level of social engagement to the position, from his vocal opposition of apartheid in South Africa to policies limiting whaling in Australian waters. Mr. Fraser continued to build on the nation's proud legacy of international engagement and human rights advocacy. Domestically, Mr. Fraser established the Human Rights Commission, introduced landmark freedom of information legislation, and oversaw policy that ended selection of migrants based on countries of origin. Since retiring from politics, the Honourable Mr. Fraser has continued to leave an indelible mark on international relations. In 1985, he chaired the United Nations hearing in New York on the role of multinationals in South Africa, and in 1989 was appointed chairman of the United Nations Committee on African Commodity Problems. He also remains actively involved in social welfare and development issues, presiding over Care International as chairman from 1990 to 1995, and serving as president of Care Australia from 1987 to 2001. Mr. Fraser also served as board member of the International Crisis Group from 1996 to 2000. His continued service to Australia and to numerous international causes has been recognised in his appointment as a Companion of the Order of Australia, his receiving the President's Gold Medal for Humanitarian Service, and as a recipient of the Australian Human Rights Medal from the Australian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. As a publication that strives to maintain strong focus on global justice here and abroad, we at the Melbourne Globalist couldn't ask for a more inspiring speaker to share his insights with us here today. It is with great honour that I now invite the Honourable Mr. Malcolm Fraser, our keynote speaker, to the stage.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, the Consul General from the United States, distinguished guests, I guess that includes pretty well everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here at the launching of the Globalist. This is the first issue, and I think it's a very exciting occasion, but it's also a very important occasion, because the publication of good, responsible media in Australia, the scope of it has been shrinking in recent years. When I was in Parliament, I think we had 7 newspaper proprietors. Now we've got, what, 1.5? For how long and a half, I'm not sure. But then the new media comes to the fore and offers new opportunities for communication of many different kinds. And it's, I believe, enormously important to take advantage of this and to make sure that the dissemination of information and the views is broadened and not narrowed within Australia. I was going to, I'm glad the Globalist is about foreign affairs, because I thought I could say one or two things about what I believe is happening in today's world. It doesn't make me particularly happy, but I'm delighted that the Globalist has chosen foreign affairs as the main part of its responsibilities, because I believe Australians are going to have decisions to make in future years which are enormously important. We've been a complacent nation in foreign policy. We have not really had a foreign policy of our own. We might think we have, we'd like to think we have, but in many ways we've not. If I asked you, was there any year in which Australia became independent? Perhaps I shouldn't ask you, but I suspect that a lot of people would say the day Australia federated. But the British government still believed that we should communicate with third governments through the Colonial Office after Federation. Deakin was bold enough to approach the President of the United States on one occasion because America was sending a fleet around the world as a goodwill gesture, and Deakin asked them to visit Sydney and Melbourne ports. And America said yes, for which Australians were duly grateful, I'm sure. But the British got, very annoyed about this. How dare we approach America directly? We should have done it through the United Kingdom. And they probably wouldn't have passed the message on because they didn't want publicity for the American Navy instead of the British Navy. But I think we have been complacent because we had no foreign and defence policy up to the beginning of the First World War. There were occasional initiatives taken by different people, but the initiatives were always designed to try and gain influence within the empire. And Australian Prime Ministers in those earlier times were always determined to say, however much we feel or however strongly we feel about this particular issue, we recognise that Britain is the ultimate determinant of empire policy. In other words, all we could do was to contribute something, hope we could change a great country's view, but we should have learnt over time, and looking at the history, that powerful countries make their own decisions. They might give the appearance of listening to people, and they might, but they don't change their own mind, they don't alter their decision, they still do what they want to do. And that was the relationship with Britain. We had one of the problems when you're my sort of age, you don't know really what's in the memory of people your sort of age, which is, there was a bill passed through the British Parliament in 1931 and 1932, which said that henceforth no act of the British Parliament can have any implications, any power, any sway over any of the dominions. Well, South Africa, Canada, and Newfoundland, which was then a dominion before it joined Canada, all rushed to apply that new law to their own circumstances and did so with great joy. Australia didn't ratify the Statute of Westminster until 1942. And the reason we didn't do it was because Sir John Latham, Sir Robert Menzies, and most of the leading politicians of the 1930s believed that if we did, it would reduce Britain's obligation to defend us. We believed that they had to defend us. And of course, when we needed help, Britain was quite unable to help. It wasn't Britain's fault, but that's the way the dice fell. And when we realized that, we turned our plea to the Americans and said, we hope you can come and help us. Well, I'm not quite sure how much of that was a voluntary decision of the United States or how much of it was because of Pearl Harbor. I've got a couple of Japanese friends that I know very well, and I'm able to say that, thank you very much for attacking Pearl Harbor, because that made sure America was going to come to our assistance. And even after Pearl Harbor, America didn't declare war on Germany, declared war on Japan. It was Germany who attacked and declared war on America 2 or 3 days later. So history is a bit of a mixed bag. But since that time, we've had a sense of dependence on the United States. And I suggest that since the end of the Cold War, with the failure of the Soviet Union, which everyone would have to applaud, our ties to the United States have become closer and closer than ever before. And today, the United States has more influence over our armed forces. Influence might be the wrong word. The right word might be control, because without American support, our armed forces would have no communications. How many people are aware that our armed forces can only operate in an operation that America approves? Because if not, we have no communications. I don't think that's very comfortable. I'm not saying we want to use our armed forces against anyone. I don't. But if we did, we should have the capacity to do so, not have to go to somebody else to ask them. And the America that I knew, the America of George Bush I, represented, in my view, a quite different America from that which represents today. The United States President H. George Bush said in 1991 in March in Congress, "Now we can see a new world coming into view, a world in which there is a very real prospect of a new world order. In the words of Winston Churchill, a world order in which the principles of justice and fair play protect the weak against the strong, a world where the United Nations, freed from the Cold War stalemate, is poised to fill the historic vision of its founders, a world in which freedom and respect for human rights find a home among all nations." George Bush's New World Order speech, just one paragraph out of it. Now those sentiments I think we would all applaud and support and want to work for 1,000-fold. But when the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was a great opportunity to bring that into being. When that George Bush went to war in Iraq, he had a coalition of 31 nations supporting the first Gulf War. And that was the way he believed it ought to work, the way he believed the United Nations ought to work. But in the second Iraq War, there were 3 nations. I'm ashamed to say Australia was one of them. And they went to war on a falsehood. Because, weapons of mass destruction, Hans Blix wasn't allowed to finish his job because he would have shown that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And in addition to that, Tony Blair left falsehoods hanging over the people of London because he knew, even I knew, I'd been out of it for a long while, that Saddam Hussein did not have missiles that could drop any sort of weapon over London, or for that matter, any other European city. He had weapons that could travel about 300 miles with great inaccuracy. And for over 40 years, 50 years perhaps, the United States has monitored every missile that takes off everywhere in the world. So the United States knows who has a missile that is accurate, that is effective, that can land where the launcher wants it to land. Japan's one of the nations that could do that. And so Australia's actually followed the United States into 3 wars. The first one I supported because I believed, as many people did, in a monolithic view of communism as a global, aggressive, and a thoroughly dangerous force. But as early as 1945, the CIA analysts, and it's important to distinguish the operational side of the CIA, which some people might have some questions about, with the analytical side of the CIA, which I think on many things, on many subjects, has done extraordinarily good and extraordinarily active and perceptive work. And one of those was the nature of the Viet Minh. Nationalist rather than communist, totally determined to bear any sacrifice, to pay any price to secure the integrity and independence of Vietnam. Now that wasn't what was depicted, that wasn't what world leaders said at the time. It was part of a global communist thrust to engulf the whole of Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese weren't interested in that, they were interested in Vietnam. The CIA also warned President Johnson, you can bomb Vietnam as much as you like, or North Vietnam or the trails. it won't diminish the Viet Cong's capacity to fight. They don't need all that much equipment. And in any case, it doesn't matter what cost you make them pay. They will pay it because they're sick of colonialism. They don't want American faces replacing French faces. And the very fact that the American army of over 500,000 people was in Vietnam made it an American war. And Diem, who was lauded in Australia and by many others for a while, was in fact put in place by the French, supported by the Americans and supported by us at the time. And I'm one of those who made mistakes at the time. But then I don't like seeing those mistakes repeated in other places, in other wars. We have followed America into 3 wars, and we should not follow America into more wars. Unless we, from our own judgment and own knowledge and own understanding, believe those wars to be right. And I can't see one in which that would happen. Bringing this up to make it a little more relevant to today, I don't think anyone can say that Western policy or American policy in the Middle East, in North Africa, has been conspicuously successful. There have been many dictators in that part of the world, and if somebody rises up to depose a dictator, we've tended automatically to say, well, they must be good, and the dictator we know to be bad, even though Tony Blair, for money, embraced Gaddafi with great fervour at one point, and then wanted to get rid of him about a year or 2 later. But does anyone know really who the people are who are in control of Libya or Tunisia? What's going to emerge ultimately in Egypt? And in Syria now, America, I'm told, is being reluctant, and I hope that reluctance is real and I hope it continues. But the Europeans want to arm the rebels. They say we'll only arm the good rebels. Well, the good rebels probably won't be ruthless enough to keep hold of the arms, and the bad rebels, Al-Qaeda, who are there, will almost certainly get them. Well, to set about now, in this year, to rearm Al-Qaeda, because of the Syrian conflict and because Syria has been governed by a dictator who's not a particularly nice person, is still not very good policy. And the Europeans want to take off the oil embargo. So knowing this, the rebels, instead of fighting Assad, start to fight each other to have control of the oil fields so they'll get the benefits of the money when the embargo is taken off. Is that very good policy on the part of the West? I think the West has no influence left in the Middle East. And if there's any country that ought to take some note of that, it's probably Israel. More forces, more military. We're a part of it, troops in Darwin. The Centre for Strategic and International Studies, with whom I did a little bit of work in the 1980s, I think, certainly a long while ago, published a large work which had been commissioned by the Pentagon. CSIS feeds off the Pentagon. Without Pentagon contracts, it would cease to exist. And so if it publishes a new policy document for the future with significant implications for American policy, it is really saying what the Pentagon wants to see fulfilled. Well, troops in Darwin is one part of it. Put an offensive air wing alongside it, offensive naval unit alongside it, and you have a fully fledged fighting marine unit stationed on Australian soil. And either our Prime Minister or the person who hopes to be Prime Minister, either of them would say yes to us and say what a wonderful thing it is. Well, to make your own sovereignty hostage to the decisions made by a country 8 or 10,000 miles away in Washington, because they're not going to say, look, Canberra, we don't like what people are doing here, we want to go and attack them, and we want to use those forces that you've so conveniently housed in Darwin. They're going to do it, and we'll read about it in the newspapers. And our Prime Minister will be told about it after the attack has been made, because that is the way these things work. And that, I believe, is a total denial of Australian sovereignty. And if we were ever independent, it's a denial of Australian independence. I don't know how many people here realise that the question of dependence gets pushed in many different ways. I know our military are very close to the American military, and they somehow have come to believe that they are told things that nobody else is told. Well, I don't really believe that's true, but I do believe that the United States senior people, as the British senior people before them were, they're very good at making other people feel important. And that's a good thing for a great power to do. It flatters lesser powers. And some people are not immune to the consequences of that. But how many people know that if you read The Guardian, you could have found out that an Australian general is second in charge of American armed forces in the Pacific? Now, if there's a stoush and we don't want to be involved, we say we want to pull embedded Australians out of American command structures, America's not going to be very comfortable with that. It's another way of tying us into decisions that they make and which makes us complicit in whatever they do. And that, the announcement was made, in fact, by a Secretary for the Army, John McHugh. It wasn't published in Australia, but it was published in The Guardian in England. And if you read The Guardian, as I do, you'd be able to find out about it. But it's just another one of the things that I believe we should not be doing, because, you know, it might be odd, but I support the ANZUS Treaty. But I have, in fact, read the ANZUS Treaty. It's a commitment to consult. It is not a commitment to defend. NATO is a commitment to defend. ANZUS is a commitment to consult, and we ought to understand that. There's a War Powers Act which requires a vote of Congress before the President can take America to war. Not always a protection, as Congress found over Vietnam. But there would need to be a War Powers resolution before the President could do anything effective to help us except to consult. And The Economist wrote, as long ago as 1961, Australia is foolish indeed if they believe that the United States would ever take Australia's side in an argument with Indonesia if, or unless, Indonesia was plainly governed by a blatantly and openly communist government. This was in the days of Sukarno, before most of you were born. I believe that to be right. The largest Islamic country in the world would rate highly in the priority of the United States. 20 million Australians, not so highly. Useful, yes. Indonesia won't allow a Marine fighting unit to be stationed in Indonesia, and we will. But that won't buy support, and it won't buy actions that could lead to the enmity of Indonesia. I know of 3 occasions when the United States has chosen Indonesia over Australia, which no Australian government is going to proclaim because they think we have a special relationship. And special relationships with great powers, whether it's Britain or the United States or anyone else, just don't exist. Great powers have their own interests. All of that is just leading up to saying It's time Australia stood up and learned to be independent, to make up its own mind, to have no external entanglements that would stop it making up its own mind. To be a nation, to be proud, to recognise that we can do a great deal of, we can do many, many good things. And our best contribution to security in our part of the world is to establish good relationships with countries of our own region, to try and diminish frictions where they exist. We could take a leaf out of Indonesia's book. When ASEAN started, it was a fragile organisation. It was basically put together by Indonesia. One of the best speeches I've read was given by Bambang Yudhoyono at a strategic conference in Singapore last year. There's an annual strategic conference where about 27, 28 countries, including the United States, and I think Australia, attend. Well, he made a speech which was saying quite plainly that problems in the Western Pacific can be resolved by the countries of the region if they're given time to do so and if others do not interfere. Now, interference, example, the Middle East, North Africa, has not led to wonderful results. We don't want that sort of interference in our part of the world. And an Australian policy would be sensible if it said, no, we don't want that. So, if the globalist, I understand that, I see the Sendaku Islands, sympathetic to the current position and the current ownership. Those islands were stolen from China as a result of the 1895 war between China and Japan. And there's one thing that, to be sure, there are a couple of, which I'm sure America would not accept, and most Australians would not be aware of. But the indignities imposed on China at that period, including the Boxer Rebellion, we even had some Australian troops in the Boxer Rebellion. We seemed incapable of keeping out of other people's wars. But America was involved, major European powers, and the indignities imposed upon China when China was weak are never going to be suffered by China ever again. And that is an absolute in Chinese policy. If you ask anyone from China, tell us about Chinese history, they don't start with Mao Zedong. They'll go back a couple of thousand years and be proud of the achievements of China over the millennia, when our ancestors were running around in woad and goatskins. And the Sendaku Islands was one of the humilities which was imposed by Japan. A Japan that has not even apologized for the rape of Nanking, where 300,000 civilians were killed by the Japanese military. Do you think China's going to give up? Now, why do all our press, why do the Americans come out here and say China is being aggressive, China is being pushing, China is creating danger? Because that's what they do. And that's what they've said. And so our press are peddling a view of the world and a view of the China which people in other parts of Asia will not accept. The last point, Goh Chok Tong, former Prime Minister of Singapore, got up last year in a meeting of 25 countries in China. Most of the countries were from this part of the world, and said, containment will not work. It is dangerous, it is foolish, it will lead to disaster, it is extraordinarily dangerous. Now, Singaporeans are notoriously reluctant to be critical of the United States for good commercial business reasons. And so that statement from Goh Chok Tong, recently retired as Prime Minister of Singapore, I think was significant. And it would be echoed by other countries around the region. And the globalist, I believe, can help us do that thinking. It's terribly important that somebody starts. I promise you they're not going to start in Canberra.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Mr. Fraser. We'd like to present you with, this is a bouquet of Australian gum and also a donation on our behalf for Care Australia, which we hope can give much needed education to communities that need it. So thank you again.
Mr. Fraser, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mr. Fabry and the entire Melbourne Globalist team, I wish to express our gratitude for you all for your attendance here tonight. Many months of hard work have gone into the creation of this enterprise, and to share the moment of its commencement with such an estimable crowd has been an honour. That concludes the formalities for this evening, but before we rise and enjoy the last of the delicious food and beverages, I would like to thank the staff of the Woodward Centre for their hospitality, if you'll join me. And I would like to further extend my thanks to the band this evening for such a lovely atmosphere. Thank you. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Please enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.